Cyberpunk is, at surface level, science fiction dealing with future urban societies dominated by computer technology. Cyberpunk is, just beneath the surface, a neon-soaked bullet train of chrome and human advancement, tales of technology, progress, and regression all at once. Stories of how far we can go, how far we've come, and why we shouldn't go any further. Cyberpunk is universally one of the most horrifying concepts and settings in all of storytelling, all for how it uses one very simple concept. Bodily autonomy is a simple concept, no matter how certain rights-suppressing groups might spin it. The right to control what is done and not done to one's own body. Medically, that's why we have do not resuscitate orders and why we always look for an all clear before an operation proceeds. When you request medical care, it's with the understanding that you will receive it and not have it withheld based on a provider's personal reasons or beliefs. When you have sex, both or all parties have to be on board for it, whatever form it's taking. If someone's body is being affected, they have to be on board for how it's being affected. Tip of the iceberg, but still, simple concept. It's that very simple concept that ripples throughout the cyberpunk genre, and Cyberpunk 2077 specifically. Bodily autonomy is one thing, but what does it become when we become modified humans? When we install ports in our bodies? When we are just enough technology in flesh to be hacked? And more concerning, what does it mean right now, while we are only organic creatures? Art imitates life. As far back as the 1960s, speculative fears of technological advancement, the loss of our humanity, and societal collapse all formed the basis for the cyberpunk genre. All of those fears bleed into various forms of bodily autonomy, both physically and technologically. First, some story setup. Cyberpunk 2077's story follows V, a mercenary starting from the bottom in metropolitan Night City with dreams of becoming a city legend, along with their newfound partner, Jackie. The main catalyst of the story is a high-risk, high-reward operation to recover the Relic, a special shard from a powerful corporate entity, protected in a reinforced, biologically sealed case. Naturally, recovery goes awry, escape must be made, and the Relic's casing is damaged, forcing Jackie to integrate the shard with his hardware. Before long, Jackie succumbs to his own fatal wounds and passes the Relic off to V. If the Relic is damaged or destroyed, nobody gets paid, and the mission was effectively for naught. But the job went super sideways, so V's fixer decides that they're too much trouble to leave alive and shoots V dead. V awakens later, resurrected by the very shard they integrated with their body, and players are introduced to Johnny Silverhand, a rocker boy anarchist who was killed half a century prior. In effect, Johnny's soul, called an engram, is embedded on the Relic. By design, the engram is slowly overriding V's personality, fundamentally erasing V with intent to replace them. Johnny does not take kindly to his new situation, and using his influence over V's body, forces them to hurt themselves in a bid to wrest control from V. The effects of Johnny's control and presence can be suppressed with a steady intake of pharmaceuticals, but only for so long. The overriding process is terminal. The more players explore Night City and fall down the rabbit hole of how do I fix this, they will discover what happened to Johnny 50 years prior. Thought dead in an anarchist attack, his body was recovered and subjected to an experimental soul killer procedure. Essentially, his personality and memories were cut from his body and pasted into a data server. There, at the end of the soul killer procedure, his body died, but he was not permitted to move on, instead forced to exist in a state of data-based limbo. Decades later, the data was cut and pasted from the server onto the Relic, dormant until V's death triggered the Relic. At first, the parallels to bodily autonomy are stark and direct. Early on with Johnny, V fights for control over their body, trying to keep it from hurting itself and preventing further harm, despite Johnny's influence. That control is wrested from V by an entity that isn't V, putting their safety at risk. That same entity now has a high degree of control over V's motor functions, manifesting in both direct physical harm and indirect harm, like tossing away the drugs that would suppress the intrusive effects. In video games especially, where interactivity and a degree of control are tantamount to the experience, having it jerked away from players is one of the most jarring experiences a game can put on them. But life imitates art, especially in the years since Cyberpunk's inception. Our own lives right now walk parallel to everything the cyberpunk genre has laid out. ever-advancing technology, the inability to explore and deepen our own humanity, and only being able to watch as society seems to eat away at itself. Our bodies are the ones left to suffer in its wake. In the medical and healthcare fields alone, patients' suffering is too often dismissed as negligible or misattributed based on a provider's presumptions. People seek out wellness and are met with disbelief, roadblocks, and a total loss of control by the very people who are intended to provide wellness. Misdiagnosis and diagnostic errors occur across the board. People are condescended to, harmed by misinformation, and left to suffer because someone else thought they knew more than the person with the problem. Second opinions are a helpful alternative, but they shouldn't have to be. The right of an individual to accept or refuse medical treatment upon themselves is protected by the Code of Federal Regulations, or, law. But receiving certain treatments remains an uphill battle for those who need it or even just want it. Aid in dying or assisted suicide for people who are terminally suffering. Transgender health for anyone who is trying to be who they are and want to express themselves as. Reproductive health and prevention items are still not easily accessible in many societies, let alone our own. The relic repaired and resurrected V after they were shot point blank. As explored throughout Cyberpunk 2077, simply being able to die at the end of a life is no longer a given. Just as Johnny was denied death, so too did the relic prevent V from fading out completely, forcing them to continue living, now in a new, hostile dynamic. Consider that 1. Nobody knew about the effects of the relic if implanted into one's hardware, or 2. That information was specifically withheld. We do what we do to our bodies with the full knowledge of what we are doing or having done to us. When we get a tattoo, we are specific about the design or agree to any changes with the artist before we commit it to our bodies. When we go in for a medical procedure, we expect to be fully informed of everything that procedure entails beforehand. We expect to know what is about to happen before it happens so that we can make the choice ourselves. If V or Jackie had known about the effects of the relic on their hardware, their personalities, their right to simply die, they may never have taken that job. If anybody involved with the job was aware of the relic's effects, it might be that they knew and elected not to share that information for fear of exactly that response. Withholding information about what is being done to one's body is a complete breach in bodily autonomy, like installing software labeled as one thing as it drops a virus somewhere in the background. Throughout history, those in positions of power have long dictated what an individual can and cannot do with their own body. Whether from a misguided sense of leadership, a pull to exert power over others, or something else entirely, politicians and governments seek to limit the choice and ability of others to make those autonomic decisions. All of this, even though at its core, such care and choices don't affect anyone outside of the individual seeking care. But let's play devil's advocate. People looking into aid in dying, transgender care, or reproductive care in its various forms impact their families, their partners, or others around them. But back to reality. Those choices never impact anyone more than the individual seeking care, and its effect on others should never diminish the individual's wants to do what they wish with their own body. Objections surrounding aid in dying have long stemmed from the Catholic Church, arguing that right-to-die bills encourage suicide and would lead people away from hope and love. Catholic hospitals, under the basis of their faith doctrines, have a track record of both denying transgender care and specifically withholding reproductive care items and abortion access. They impart their collective, singularly based spirituality upon a collective who may or may not share their faith or their level of faith, denying the one thing a hospital is designed to provide: medical care. On the one hand, that is their prerogative, same as any business has their guidelines and policies. But on the other hand, when people live in an area where only Catholic hospitals are accessible, then it becomes a matter of control. Everyone is different and has different needs that need meeting. Flowchart approaches to diagnosis don't always work and don't always apply to everyone. The umbrella approach of politicians and legislation seem dictated with the understanding that all bodies operate the same, when they simply don't. By generalizing, no matter the intent, others' bodily autonomy is left in flux. Even if it works for many people, it may not work for all people. Ask anyone who's had to dabble to find the right antidepressant. There's no one panacea for depression, and sometimes you need to experiment to find what works for you. The freedom and ability to experiment, to individualize rather than generalize, can be life-saving, but is too often denied. Players are able to upgrade their own cybernetic modifications throughout their adventures, including quick hacking skills. By simply looking at and scanning another individual, provided they have cybernetic implants themselves, players and enemies alike can quick hack each other for a variety of effects. For example, my go-to quick hacks were Short Circuit, zapping a target's hardware with enough force to stun, Overheat, which started burning and overclocking a target's processors over time, Memory Wipe, adjusting a target's short-term memory to drop them out of a heightened combat state, and Reboot Optics, forcing a target's optical implants to reboot, rendering them blind for a short amount of time. Others involve blasting a target's core synapses with violent force, rendering their weapons useless for a crucial few seconds, forcing a hard shutdown and dropping them unconscious, even compelling them to commit suicide. With some relatively easy-to-acquire hardware, anyone off the streets can waltz into their friendly neighborhood Ripperdoc, get the implants, and start hacking entire humans with rudimentary software. And that's a lot to consider. To have the power to just render someone blind, deaf, or dead without them ever knowing you were there in broad daylight is horrifying. Bodily autonomy means nothing when your body can simply be hacked like a machine. For me, the worst part is how much I relied on it. I built my version of V around quick hacking and affecting others without laying a finger on them. By near the end of the game, I was incapacitating and dropping entire legions of enemies without firing a single shot. And it felt amazing. And therein lies the root cause of why someone would do anything to another's bodily autonomy: power and control. In a setting where organized gangs and corporate militias exert power and control over others, so too did I enjoy taking control back from them, even for just a moment. But those gang members and corporate militaries, often in positions of being controlled themselves, lash out at others less powerful than them in order to regain that sense of control. In the world of Night City, the hierarchy of who has control and who doesn't is plain to see. Anyone with any power to speak of holds onto it tight, bludgeoning anyone who gets close enough to threaten it. Consider the firestorm of Roe v. Wade's life cycle. In 1973, Roe v. Wade established the constitutional right to choose to have an abortion in the United States, for anyone who can afford the services at least. Twice since then, on the federal level, people in power have demonstrated their belief that they know better than, and for, everyone. In 1992, those rights were revised in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, permitting the state's circumstances to prevent and restrict abortion, chiefly 1. If a patient sought abortion after viability, around 23 to 26 weeks gestation, and 2. With the state's overarching interests in protecting the health of the woman and the life of the fetus that may become a child. The state's interest. Remember that. And in 2022, Roe v. Wade was overturned entirely with Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, blowing open floodgates for crippling new legislation on the state level. Bodies and procedures were policed even further. Abortion access, even at the risk of the carrier's life, was stifled out and criminalized. The hard line established between what is allowed and what isn't lends itself to a binary: right and wrong, permitted and forbidden, applied to many and mandated by few. What is withheld is terrifying. What is forced upon others, whether unknowingly or coercively, is a different shade of terrifying, and those methods harken back to various eugenics projects from the mid-1900s. Eugenics is the belief and practice of optimizing generations of humans by excluding, quote, inferior people and groups from the population gene pool. What constitutes inferior is entirely subjective, and that definition varies from follower to follower. For reference, Hitler was a big fan of the whole thing. So, not great. But consider that. Various forms of birth control have been administered to people before they were officially approved for distribution and use, seemingly in spite of the warnings and side effects. Others present it to people as one of two options: take this contraceptive or face alternatives like jail time or loss of welfare benefits. Maybe you'll get a paltry sum for your definitely not coerced sterilization. Others have been used to bar entry to entire regions. People could not enter or immigrate unless birth control injections were administered. Others still use sterilization as a way to improve medical rankings. This largely remains an international issue, manifesting differently from region to region, but almost always with the underlying desire to control who can and can't have children. Again, never addressing the systemic issues that put people in compromised positions, just slapping bandages over it. Roe v. Wade's repeal, the acts of ensuing legislation, and eugenics-based projects the world over all strip away a person's individual needs and autonomy. And for what? The belief system of a stark minority applied to everyone, with no attempt to address systemic problems anywhere to be seen. Control, thinly masked as a moral good. Within the spheres of control and hierarchy in Cyberpunk 2077 are the dolls. Individuals of all genders who are fitted with doll chips, which 1. Import data from central systems, 2. Control a doll's behavior like a human autopilot, and 3. Wipe a doll's short-term memory after the autopilot has shut down. While militaristic in origin, the doll function found more widespread use in the sex industry. Dolls are physically customized based on a client's preference pulled from that central system. They behave based on those same preferences, and they have no recollection of anything they do or that is done to them while in doll mode. Here, the concept of bodily autonomy gets dicey. On the one hand, sure, the user is consenting by virtue of their work to have the doll chip activated as paying clients necessitate it. But in that gray area between conscious awareness, is it enough to say that the user gave blanket consent for anything that could possibly happen? One might see it as a perk to zone out and not remember work, but that's a long time to not account for your full autonomy, especially in such an intimate sector. Transgender people have long run into issues regarding their own identities. Until 2017, the European Union forced sterilization on anyone looking to acquire new legal gender recognition. Japan's Supreme Court has ruled as recently as 2019 that in order to receive new gender recognition, transgender people had to have their original reproductive organs removed. The law is constitutional because it was meant to reduce confusion in families and societies. A collective's wants take precedence over the individual's needs according to a ruling few. Keep considering hierarchy and its effects. There are a couple side missions where you assist a popular mayoral candidate, Jefferson Perales, and his wife, Elizabeth, with a series of requests. Their last mission involves investigating their home following an attempted break-in, though they are both fuzzy on the details surrounding it. Through a bit of sleuthing, V helps to uncover an ongoing plot from their in-home security team. Memory and behavior modification directly targeting Mr. and Mrs. Perales. More sleuthing ensues, and while downloading damning evidence of the plot, a mysterious and unknown party starts remotely wiping the data. A short time later, V is contacted by them. They warn, very simply, that nothing can change what is already in motion and that V needs to stop trying to interfere. Jefferson is already gunning to be a powerful figure in Night City with influence over a great many of its political operations. By altering and adjusting who the Peraleses fundamentally are, this unknown party is completely stripping their bodily autonomy away. Not only that, but it is with intent to exert power, to create a puppet mayor, unaware that they are even a puppet. At this point of awareness, Elizabeth begs V to keep Jefferson in the dark, if only for their sense of safety. She is concerned for their immediate autonomy and safety, but allowing Jefferson to continue uninformed risks impacting everyone in the city. The pyramid of power and its impact trickles ever downward. The person in power directly affects what the citizens of Night City can do with their lives, however noble Jefferson may still seem after his modifications. It's impossible to discuss bodily autonomy, especially in America, without recognizing police brutality and violence. From such violence largely stemming from nonviolent or traffic-related offenses, the hundreds of annual murders of innocent, fleeing, or frightened individuals, street-side searches, strip searches, cavity searches, blood traw warrants, often with little to no justification in doing so, there is a great deal of flexibility with what is permitted and allowed from police. People are robbed of their bodily autonomy daily. That loss, that violation of bodily autonomy ranges from suffering through an unrelated and invasive search to a life ended for everything from a misunderstanding to an overreaction. This is to say nothing of the power abuse within detentions and prisons. Then there's forcing a person into the armed forces due to draft, conscription, or otherwise against their individual will and wishes. Worse, offering people a semblance of financial security in service of a system that person would help perpetuate in exchange for that person's whole being, up to and including their life. Consider a ruling power taking a person's entire body for their own use, or convincing them to give it willingly, whether in wartime or not. Deus Ex Human Revolution finds a near-future world trying to blend cybernetic augmentations with the human experience. The divides between augs and other humans are becoming more stark, not the least of which because augmentations can be rejected by the human body, requiring an expensive pharmaceutical drug to block the negative effects. Bodily autonomy is simply wanting to live, wanting to experience having full control over your body. The world of Deus Ex mars autonomy itself by requiring its users to afford the luxury of existence, first with augmentations, then with the suppressant drugs. If not, then they continue to suffer with their organic flesh. Further, with a surge in manufactured malfunctions, augmentations are cycled and embedded with new biochips. Though obviously unadvertised, the new chips are specifically designed to control the users. Before long, the chips are altered to send all augmented humans into a state of blind, violent frenzy, completely independent of their own wants and desires. Underneath all of this, the chip was designed as a kill switch for various augmentations, and perhaps augmented people as a whole. The great parallel between cyberpunk and reality is rooted in Western civilization, capitalism, which perpetuates a need for power, production, and the people orbiting both. In order for capitalism to survive, or thrive depending on your perspective, capitalists need producers, those making the clothing, serving the food, running the stores. So our bodies are exhausted in service to the system. None of us asked to be here in this system, we were simply brought into it, the expectation being that we have to trade our own selves, piece by piece, hour by hour, to afford our existence. It treats the professional life as far more fulfilling than the personal life. It treats everyone and everything as a resource to be used and eventually discarded, all for temporary consumption. That's the state interest in all those fetuses noted earlier. A resource capable of producing more resources. We don't get to own our own bodies in this ultimate societal breach of our own autonomy. The Red Strings Club follows characters who are trying to undermine the social psyche welfare system. The system is designed to alter the minds of cyber-enhanced and implanted humans, so as to eliminate emotions like anger and depression. Emotions, even negatively perceived ones, define us and make us human. Still, we already have pharmaceutical drugs to both dampen and amplify certain chemical responses in the human body, as overwhelming as they can already be. If the ability to control emotions came from a more neutral place, perhaps it wouldn't be as concerning a concept. But it's the corporate fingers laced throughout the process that concern the characters most. A corporation stands to gain the most by eliminating emotions altogether, or having a direct hand in controlling those emotions moment to moment. When we can't even trust our own feelings, what do we have left? Our own bodies are destined to fail. Given medical knowledge and advancements at this time, it is inevitable. Our Western healthcare as an arm of society is designed to treat illness, not address the root social causes of illness. People become dehumanized objects of study, resources to be billed for however long they can afford it, then turned over to fill the bed anew, to say nothing for how much it costs, nor the labyrinthine process that insurance continues to be. If people cannot be cured nor collected from, then they are left to their devices, left to suffer, and all too often, left to die. Cloudpunk gives players the vertical city of Nivalis to travel through as a courier for hire, but most concerning is your dispatcher, Control. Control, as players learn, is not actually a person as expected, but more akin to the engram of Johnny in Cyberpunk 2077, a digital carryover of who Control was in life, forced to continue working after his physical body died, simply so he could pay off debts accrued in life. If there's anything I look forward to at the end of life, it's never having to work again. To have that very simple freedom threatened because my very existence costs money that nobody seems to make enough of, is genuinely terrifying. Our own bodily autonomy is rejected the world over, whether due to a lack of resources, lack of finances, lack of knowledge or awareness, or lack of government support. And even if we want to live, want to keep existing, to do so can ruin us financially. The system feels designed to make it easier to surrender and simply let nature run its course, no matter what we want and no matter what resources we know are available. Medically, as our bodies give out and throughout our lives, we are made to weigh the options of what we want versus what we can actually afford to do versus what we're even allowed to do. Survival can mean ruin. survival may not even be an option simply because of who we are or where we live. Our bodies, it seems, were never truly our own. In all of these stories, the characters persevere, just as we persevere in our own lives. Whether in spite of the world they find themselves in, or because there is no alternative they can fathom except continuing. Our world is terrifying. Cyberpunk is also terrifying. But amidst the shadows of what to fear and what already looms over us, there is the other side of bodily autonomy. True, unfettered choice. In both Cyberpunk stories and in our own lives, the choice to truly open up to another person, to be vulnerable, to be authentic, means that much more when we are so vulnerable, be it from cybernetic hacking or the legislation of a minority rule. Cyberpunk 2077's major side missions elaborate on 4 different citizens' plights in and around Night City, and also help them grow closer to V. Throughout these missions, they begin to open up more and more, just as V does with them, trying to make a difference, the capacity for cruelty in humanity, coming to grips with independence and family, sharing your past, even the parts you're not proud of, defining or redefining who you are. There's no hacking or manipulation, just a choice to be open with someone, and them being open back. In a world where autonomy is so easily taken from people, finding those you're willing to give yourself to, both emotionally and physically, feels that much more impactful. And that brings us to the final moments of the final mission in Cyberpunk 2077. V and Johnny, finally past all external conflict, have to decide who's going to remain in V's body. Their relationship has changed since those frightening introductory moments. Johnny has been content to be along for the ride, if not a bit of a backseat driver, and has promised to do right by V when push comes to shove. He's even built up enough trust to be given full control of V's body every so often to help wrap up some personal loose ends. Concerns of who controls whom have melted away, as both parties are now just invested in V's survival. In the end, the final choice can be a reflection of that same trust. I chose to view it that way. Controlling Johnny from the final mission, I walked him towards the light, to finally move on after decades in limbo. It left V to live tenant-free in their own body. Perhaps this form of connection and trust was more forced given the circumstances. Still, it is a connection built all the same, forced into being by disparate parties who saw fit to rob V and Johnny of the same thing. In my story, that connection ultimately ends with Johnny making good on his promise earlier in the narrative, to be the one to fade away when the time comes. In the most horrifying of circumstances, when bodily autonomy is taken, perhaps all that can be done is to try and make it right. Cyberpunk is an upsetting genre to consider, as much as it is a fantastic setting for our modern era. It is a filthy mirror, reflecting the worst of humanity and society right back at us. Its worlds project a thin veneer of, ooh, look what technology can help us do, while its powers sidestep and downplay the human cost of it all, namely bodily autonomy. Reality, too, is terrifying, and the lines between fiction and reality creep closer and closer to each other every day. But in everything that Cyberpunk is, there is something beautiful walking on those neon-lit streets, even as the world falls apart around them. Humans, holding that much tighter to what makes them human. Love, authenticity, connection, all freely and willingly given. When we are given the choice to give a piece of ourselves to someone else in a setting where it can simply be taken from us without our knowing, that is the beauty in the nightmare. It's feeling safe enough for just a moment to loosen our grip and take someone else's soul with ours. It's choosing to be emotional in a cold and data-driven world. To give in to memories, impulses, what was, what can be, in the hopes of making something better. Not everything, but something. To fight for something better. To truly live in a world that demands you merely exist, or worse, produce. Choosing connection where it isn't guaranteed they will be there tomorrow. In our real world and within the cyberpunk worlds, it means more that we hold onto our connections with others because we want to, not because we have to. It's finding someone to care for in the bleak shadows of Cloudpunk's Nivalis, choosing connection and purpose amidst the nightmare of existence. Or giving people the ability to choose in Deus Ex Human Revolution, Though it may not save the world, better to let people decide their own future than let any ruling power try to influence them any further. We're deciding in the closing tragic seconds of the Red Strings Club to let someone know you love them, rather than risk anything else being your last message to them. And maybe it's just trying, despite everything, to be attached in a world or a city that runs on detachment. This is not to wash away everything terrifying about the genre, or everything haunting about our own lives that parallel it. When control is taken from us, we are worse for it. But more importantly, the inverse is true. We have shown time and time again that when people are given autonomy over their bodies, they are better for it. Plain and simple. In the end, we hold tight to what brings us comfort, peace, and joy, however brief, however fleeting. That way, we have a template to smudge out the things that frighten us, no matter how long it takes us to do so.